Hey there. Welcome back to another peaceful evening together. Tonight's story is stitched together with memory, scent, and the soft colors of love that never faded. It's about Joan, a retired seamstress who finds an old yellow scarf tucked away in a cedar chest. It once belonged to Marc, her first love, from a golden autumn afternoon in Paris. The scarf still carries the faint scent of lavender, and with it, a flood of memories from a day they promised never to forget. Before we begin, if these quiet stories bring you comfort, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, or maybe share something small you've kept all these years, something that still makes your heart pause. Sometimes, it's the softest things that hold the strongest echoes. Now, dim the lights, let the night surround you, and join me in tonight's gentle journey where a single scarf unfolds a story stitched in love, memory, and the colors of youth. Joan didn't mean to find the scarf. She was simply cleaning out the bottom drawer of the old pine dresser, the one that stuck on the left side and had to be opened with 2 hands and a soft curse. She had folded and refolded the same linens 3 times already, not out of purpose but out of habit. Then, beneath a stack of faded tablecloths and an apron that hadn't been worn since the 80s, she felt something smooth beneath her fingertips. It was soft, delicate, silk. She pulled it out slowly. The yellow scarf unfolded like sunlight, a warm, worn fabric that shimmered faintly, even in the quiet shadows of the room. Time had softened its edges and dulled its brightness, but it still held the color of afternoon. And the scent. Lavender. Joan held it to her face without thinking. It smelled the same. Not of the sachets she now kept in her drawers, not the synthetic lavender of store shelves, but true lavender, like the oil Marc used to wear, faint and sweet, with a touch of something earthier beneath. A scent that didn't just sit on the skin, it lingered in the air, in memory. Joan closed her eyes, and she was no longer standing in her cottage in Sussex. She was 23 again, in Paris. The scarf was around Marc's neck, tucked beneath the collar of a linen coat, fluttering gently in the wind as they walked along the Seine. The leaves had been falling, golden and careless. The city had smelled of roasted chestnuts and damp stone. That was the afternoon they promised to remember. Joan's fingers tightened slightly around the scarf. She opened her eyes and folded it once, gently, then again. Her hands were slower now. Her knuckles thickened with age, but the movement was the same, precise, practiced, quiet. The way she had folded silks for clients in her shop for decades. The way she once folded Marc's scarf that very night, tucking it into her suitcase with shaking hands. The scarf had waited for her all these years, and now, with the scent rising like memory through the air, Joan sat on the edge of the bed and let herself go back, not in sorrow, not in regret, but in softness, because some love stories are too brief to grow old, and some colors never truly fade. Paris in October was always softer than it looked in postcards. The light didn't shout, it whispered. It filtered through the gold of turning leaves and danced off the river with a grace that made you walk slower, even if you had somewhere to be. Joan didn't have anywhere to be that day. She had arrived in the city on a whim, with a small suitcase, a pair of worn gloves, and the conviction that if she was ever going to see the world, she'd better do it before someone else filled her days with appointments and expectation. She wandered the riverside markets, admiring the stalls filled with books and sketches and hand-dyed scarves. The city moved around her like a breeze, constant but never pushy. She liked that. And then she saw him. Marc. He was standing at a table of watercolors, his dark hair pinned in a loose twist, a smear of blue ink on his wrist. He wore a linen coat, boots scuffed at the toe, and a yellow scarf that looked like it had been dyed in sunshine. Before we move to the depths of the story, I want to ask you something gently. What does God mean to you? How has He helped you to reach this moment? To carry your story day by day, even when you felt unsure or unseen? You see, someone out there might need your answer. Your quiet belief, your journey with Him. It might be the seed that grows in someone else's heart. Maybe you don't have the words right now. That's okay. Maybe your whole life is your answer. But if you feel it tonight, whisper a thank you. Remember how far you've come. Not by chance, not by strength alone, but by grace. And maybe tomorrow, or the next day, someone will believe a little deeper, because you held on to faith and shared it with love. If you're comfortable, take a moment to share your answer in the comments, even just a sentence. It might be exactly what someone else needs tonight. Let's go into depth on the story now. Joan couldn't have said what made her pause, only that she did. Marc looked up and smiled, not the polite smile of a stranger, but the easy kind, like they already knew each other and had just bumped into one another by chance. Beautiful, aren't they? He asked, gesturing to the paintings. His voice had an accent. Joan couldn't play Spanish, maybe. Soft, lilting, musical in a way that made everything else in the world feel suddenly dull. Joan nodded. Yes, very. They talked. For a long time. About art and cities and fabrics, and why the world seemed to tilt a little different in autumn. Marc had a way of asking questions that made you forget to guard your answers. At some point, Marc offered her a drop of lavender oil from a small bottle in his pocket. For the wrist, he said, to hold the mood. Joan laughed, unsure if she was being teased or enchanted. Maybe both. And then Marc said, "Walk with me." So Joan did. They walked along the Seine, under the rustling leaves, past couples and painters, and the smell of roasting chestnuts. They stopped for coffee at a corner cafe where the chairs all faced the street. Marc talked with his hands. Joan listened with her eyes. By late afternoon, they sat on a bench beneath a tree whose branches dropped gold around them with every breeze. "I leave in the morning," Marc said softly. Joan didn't ask where or why. Instead, she asked, "Will I see you again?" Marc didn't answer, not with words. He took off the yellow scarf and draped it gently around Joan's neck. "Remember me in yellow," he whispered, "and in lavender, and in this light." Joan reached up and touched the scarf, unsure of what to say. It was still warm from Marc's skin. It smelled like lavender in autumn, and the closeness of someone you've only just met but feel you've always known. She opened her mouth to speak, but Marc only smiled. "It's okay," he said. "We don't need more than this." Joan had thought that kind of connection was something you built over months, maybe years. But here it was, given to her on a park bench under a yellowing tree with no future promised. Just this moment offered in full. They walked a little more after that, silent, shoulder to shoulder. As the sky deepened to dusk, Marc walked her to the metro station. They didn't kiss. They didn't exchange addresses. But Marc reached out and squeezed Joan's hand once, briefly, with both warmth and finality. Then he turned and walked into the crowd. Joan stood there for a long time. The scarf was clutched in her hand. The scent of lavender rose in the cold air like something sacred. She never saw him again, but from that day forward, every time she saw yellow, she thought of Marc. And when she smelled lavender true, Lavender Shea remembered what it felt like to be seen fully, without need, without fear. It was only one afternoon, but some afternoons last longer than entire seasons of your life. The scarf had been folded and tucked away for decades. And yet, as Joan ran her fingers along the silk now, the memory returned not like a flicker, but like a full bloom. She remembered everything, not in the way you remember a story told too often, but as if she'd stepped back inside it. Marc's laughter. That was the first thing. Not loud, not showy, but rich, like honey poured slowly from a spoon. It had drifted through the autumn air and made Joan smile before she even realized she was smiling. They had walked aimlessly through side streets, wandering from one curiosity to the next. A street musician played a quiet waltz on a violin by the bridge, and Marc gave him a coin with a wink. "Art deserves to eat," he'd said. They shared a crepe from a stand en Rue Mouffetard cinnamon, and Abland laughed when the powdered sugar dusted Joan's jacket. "Now you look like a pastry," Marc teased, brushing it away. Joan remembered how he'd reached out to help, his fingers unexpectedly soft, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. His touch left behind a trail warmer than any fire. The city moved around, them buses groaning, pigeons scattering, couples arguing softly in corners, but Marc and Joan floated just outside of it all, wrapped in their own orbit of golden leaves and quiet glances. Marc told stories with his hands about the paintings he wanted to make, about the way color changed when you were in love. He spoke of yellow not as a shade, but as a feeling. "It's not brightness," he said. "It's memory. Yellow is what lingers." Joan didn't know how to respond. She didn't need to. She just watched him. Watched the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, how his lips moved when he said the word, always. By mid-afternoon, they found a park bench tucked behind a row of sycamores. Leaves fell around them like confetti no one had thrown. They sat in silence for a long time, knees barely touching. Joan had never been brave. She had been kind, she had been careful, but never brave. Not until she reached for Marc's hand. Marc didn't flinch. He turned his palm upward and threaded his fingers through Joan's, as if it had always been meant, as if they'd done it 100 times before. Neither of them spoke. The world around them continued, bells ringing in the distance, a breeze rattling the trees. But inside that moment, everything slowed. Even the wind seemed to hush. Joan had never held another man's hand like that before. Not in public, not without explanation. But Marc didn't ask for reasons or apologies. He just held on, gently, like Joan's hand belonged there, like she belonged there. When the breeze picked up, Marc tucked the yellow scarf around Joan's neck. "Keep this," he said, smiling faintly. "I want you to wear it when you need to feel brave." Joan nodded, barely able to breathe. She looked into Marc's eyes and saw no fear, no hurry, only truth. And she realized this wasn't a story that needed more chapters to be real. Some stories are complete in a single afternoon. The sun drifted lower, casting long golden shadows across the cobblestones. The air cooled, but Joan felt warm like she was lit from within. They stayed on the bench until dusk began to settle, watching the light soften everything it touched. Marc talked about the colors of Paris show. The buildings changed hue depending on the hour, how shadows painted stories on old brick. And Joan, who had always looked at life in threads and seams, began to see it in brushstrokes. They ducked into a bookshop near the Latin Quarter. Joan bought an old poetry volume with frayed corners. Marc signed the inside with a single sentence. For the moment, that needed nothing more. They spent the last light of day sitting by the canal, tossing crumbs to ducks and watching boats drift by, both quiet, both full. Marc hummed a melody Joan didn't know, and Joan found herself swaying gently, the scarf brushing her collarbone. The closeness between them wasn't rushed. It wasn't confessed in big words or grand gestures. It was felt, understood, as natural as breath. And when it was time to part, neither of them said goodbye. They simply stood, their hands brushing once more, the scarf tucked gently in place. Joan walked away first. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. That moment had stitched itself into her heart, the kind of stitch that never comes undone. And though they never spoke again, never wrote, never tried to follow what came next, that golden afternoon lived forever in yellow silk and lavender scent, in the curve of his smile, and in the quiet courage of one soft shared breath. Because sometimes, one good day can last you a lifetime. And sometimes, the boldest thing you can do is say yes to something fleeting and let it stay beautiful by letting it stay brief. Joan didn't speak of Marc after Paris, not because she was ashamed, and not because she wanted to forget, but because some stories are meant to be carried, not shared. Like pressed flowers in a book, they are most beautiful in quiet, most alive in the stillness of memory. She returned to London in November. The city greeted her with gray skies and the scent of coal smoke. Life resumed no fanfare, no remarkable change. Her parents asked about the trip. She gave simple answers. Yes, the Seine was lovely. Yes, the art was marvelous. No, she hadn't fallen in love. Not exactly. She returned to work, first for a tailor near Charing Cross, then in a bridal shop tucked into a quiet lane. Her hands became known in the neighborhood. Nimble, steady, gentle. There was a reverence in the way she handled fabric, as if every thread held a story. Perhaps, for her, it did. The yellow scarf remained folded in the top drawer of her dresser. She never wore it, never moved it. But now and then, when the days were long or her heart was restless, she would take it out and hold it. The lavender scent, though faint, still lingered. A ghost of a touch, a breath from the past. Time passed with a rhythm of its own. She worked. She moved to a small flat above a cafe. She adopted a cat named Olive, who hated strangers and loved sunbeams. Friends came and went. She was invited to weddings, baby showers, and retirements. She brought thoughtful gifts, never stayed too late, and left before anyone noticed her eyes drifting toward the windows. She didn't marry. She never explained why. There were offers, some quiet, some bold, but Joan always smiled and declined with grace. She had learned in Paris what it meant to feel full in just a single moment, and she'd never felt empty since. By her mid-30s, she opened her shop. It wasn't grand. A narrow storefront between a bookstore and a florist. The windows always fogged in winter. The bell above the door rang with a sound that felt like memory. She called it Joan Wren, fine tailoring, and painted the letters herself in soft gold. The community welcomed her. Soon, her days were filled with alterations, fittings, and conversations held over pins and steaming irons. Customers came not just for her skill, but for the quiet kindness that seemed to live in the very air of the shop. She hemmed uniforms, patched trousers, relined coats for elderly widowers who told her stories of the war. She stitched gowns for girls who never dreamed they'd wear something so beautiful. She folded each garment with care, always finishing with a flourish of tissue and ribbon. And every once in a while, she'd pause her fingers lingering on silk, on yellow cloth, on a swatch of lavender tucked in someone's hem, and Marc would return. Not with sadness, but with a warmth like sunlight through curtains. She never sought him out, never asked questions, never flipped through directories or called foreign numbers. She didn't need to. Marc had given her a moment, a color, a scent. That was enough. She lived well, simply. She read novels in the bath. She made tea every morning in the same dented kettle. She planted herbs in her window boxes and fed sparrows from her palm. She became Miss Joan to the neighborhood children who brought her candy and scribbled cards. On Sundays, she went to the market. She never bought much, but once a year, she would find a vendor selling French lavender, fresh and fragrant in little cloth sachets. She would buy just one, carry it home, and place it gently beside the scarf. Sometimes, she wondered where Marc had gone, whether he had stayed in Paris, whether he had painted those dreamscapes he once described to shins made of glass, faces built from flowers. Sometimes Joan imagined he had traveled to Spain or Italy, or someplace warm where his laugh would still rise above the breeze. But Joan never let herself imagine Marc's end, only his continuation. She imagined him alive in the world, somewhere, a man of yellow scarves and ink-stained fingers, a man who once said, "Remember me like this." And she did. Joan aged softly. Like fabric left in a drawer, she faded gently at the edges, but stayed strong at the seams. Her hands curled slightly with time, but her stitches remained straight. Her eyesight dimmed, but her sense of color never dulled. When she turned 70, her niece offered to help her close the shop. But Joan wasn't ready. The bell still rang, and there were still seams to mend. There was something sacred in the rhythm of the work, in folding a hem, in tying a bow, in the hush of scissors over satin. And always, when she folded silk, she thought of Marc. She folded as if every crease mattered, as if every corner remembered something, because in a way, they did. Her life had not been lonely. It had been hers, stitched carefully, day by day, from a memory that never unraveled. Marc was not a regret. He was a thread, not the only one, but the one that gave all the others their color. The drawer creaked softly as Joan pulled it open. She had meant only to put away a sweater, but her hand paused, hovered, and then shifted. She reached deeper, beneath a stack of carefully folded scarves, until her fingers brushed silk. Familiar, cool to the touch. She lifted it gently 2 folds. One smooth turn, and there it was. The yellow scarf. It had faded more than she expected. Not much, but just enough to catch her breath. The sunlight shade had mellowed to honey. The edges, once sharp, had softened and curled. Still beautiful, still hers. She held it up to the light, and for a moment, the air seemed to shift. Not the room, but something inside her, as if part of her had been waiting quietly, patiently for her to remember. The scent lingered. Lavender. It was fainter now, like a whisper at the edge of a dream. But it was there, enough to stir something deep in her chest, enough to carry her back, not in time, but in feeling. She walked to her chair by the window, scarf in hand, and sat with a quiet sigh. The world outside was late spring birds in the hedge, the garden humming with bees. But in her mind, leaves rustled underfoot, and the Seine glittered. She laid the scarf in her lap. "I've missed you," she said softly. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. There was no grief in it, just a gentle recognition, the kind that comes not from longing, but from reunion. She closed her eyes and leaned her head back. She didn't try to recreate the moment, didn't grasp for detail. She simply let Marc arrive in presence, in warmth, in memory. "You said yellow would help me be brave," she whispered. It did. Her fingers stroked the edge of the scarf, tracing the years into its thread. "I wore it once," she said, "on the day I opened my shop, just for a moment, just to feel like I could. And again, on a day when she was tired. And again, on a day she was lonely. Never for show. Always in secret. Just long enough to remember who she had been, who she still was, deep beneath the quiet life she had stitched together." She smiled. "It was never really about Paris," she said. She imagined Marc sitting beside her, legs crossed, hair a little grayer now, eyes still bright. She imagined him listening, nodding. "It was about you. It was about that feeling that I could be more than careful, that I could say yes." She paused, even if it was only once. The room was warm with late sun. A breeze moved through the open window, and the curtain shifted, slow and soft, as if breathing. Joan closed her eyes again. "I never found you," she said, "but I never forgot you." That felt important to say. Not dramatic, just true. "You were my secret beginning," she whispered. And she meant it. Not the start of a great romance, not the one that got away, but the place from which she began to bloom, the silent courage that lived in her ever since. The moment that made everything after feel like it could be lived more deeply. The scarf, warm now from her touch, rested in her lap like something sacred. She didn't need a photograph, didn't need letters. What she held in her heart was far more complete than anything framed or written down. It was made of sound and scent and color, made of a golden afternoon and one shared breath. Joan stood, slowly, and crossed the room. She placed the scarf beside her pillow, smoothed it flat, and sat on the edge of the bed. "I hope you had a good life," she whispered. "I hope someone else made you laugh, the way you made me feel seen." She paused, then chuckled. "And if no one else ever understood you, at least once, I did." The light outside softened into evening. Her garden, now half in shadow, swayed gently under the breath of twilight. Somewhere, a bird called out a final song for the day. Joan felt still. Not nostalgic, not wistful, just whole. She had always thought memory would fade, but some things don't dim. They just quiet themselves. They become part of the background hum of who you are. They become home. She folded the scarf again, precisely, lovingly, And in that small act, she felt as close to Marc as she had ever been. The house was quiet now. Outside, the moon hung low above the garden, casting silver light across the ivy-lined fence. The wind had calmed, and the air carried only the gentlest sound-saw creak of old wood, a distant owl, the hush of leaves shifting softly in their sleep. Joan lay in bed, the yellow scarf folded neatly on her pillow beside her. She didn't need to hold it anymore. It was enough just to know it was there. The scent of lavender lingered faintly in the air, blending with the cool breeze that drifted through the open window. The curtains swayed like breath. The stillness wrapped around her shoulders like a second blanket, warm and quiet. She looked once more at the scarf and closed her eyes. What a strange and beautiful thing it was to feel so full from something so small. A piece of fabric, a splash of color, a moment long past that had never left her, not really. A voice, a hand, a promise. Joan took a slow breath, and then another, not thinking, not remembering, just being. Her limbs relaxed into the mattress, her body softened, her thoughts quieted, her heartbeat slowed like a lullaby. She was not searching anymore, not for what had been or what might still be. She was right where she needed to be in this room, in this peace, with the night folded gently around her like silk. And in the quiet, she imagined Marc again, not as a ghost, not as a dream, but as a soft presence beside her. Legs tucked up, hair falling loose over his shoulder, eyes watching the moonlight with the same quiet wonder. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Some moments are too sacred for words. Joan smiled. She remembered the scarf as it was bright and fluttering in the wind. She remembered Marc's hands, the warm press of his fingers as he tied it around Joan's neck. "Wear this when you need to feel brave," he had said. She had. All her life, she had. Joan shifted beneath the covers. The bed was warm now, her breathing light. She felt wrapped not only in blankets, but in memory and a love that had never asked for anything more than to be held once and carried always. There was no ending to the story, because it had never needed one. It was never about forever. It was about a single day, a golden afternoon, a scarf dyed in sunlight and scented in lavender, a love that didn't fade, but folded itself into the quiet corners of her life and stayed. She had lived well. She had remembered well. And now, she could rest well. The air in the room stilled. Joan's breath slowed with it. She curled slightly on her side, the scarf still within reach, the breeze soft against her cheek. A quiet filled the space between heartbeats. And in that calm, glowing place, between waking and sleep, her thoughts drifted like petals on still water. She was not lonely. She was not waiting. She was simply resting on a life well lived, in a heart carefully stitched, with a love that had never frayed. "Good night," she whispered, and sleep came like yellow silk, soft, certain, steady. Some stories live not in chapters or endings, but in colors, in scents, in the quiet folds of memory we carry with us through life. Joan's story was never one of epic romance. It was something softer, something quieter. A single day in Paris, a yellow scarf, a voice that called her brave. It was about the power of one golden moment and how deeply that moment can shape the rest of a life. She never needed to see Marc again, because what they shared was already complete. It wasn't unfinished, it was just brief. And that brevity made it beautiful. It made it lasting. Joan stitched her life with care, surrounded by silence, silk, and small joys. But always, gently woven through everything, was that golden thread, that memory of yellow and lavender, of laughter and courage, of saying yes. She didn't hold on to the past out of sadness. She honored it. She let it live beside her. And in doing so, she created a life stitched with peace. Maybe you carry something like that too. A scarf, a photo, a sentence someone once said that never quite left your heart. Maybe you've held on to something small that, somehow, made your life bigger. And maybe, just like Joan, that one small memory doesn't ask for closure just for a quiet place to rest. Thank you for listening tonight. I hope this story brought you comfort. If you enjoyed it, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing what memory you've carried through the years. Until next time, may your dreams be gentle, and may the loves you've known, however brief, stay with you always. Good night.